Welcome to Richer Soul, Christa Camarillo. It's great to have you join us today.
Well, thank you so much, Rocky, for having me. Pleasure being here.
And I'm excited to learn from you today. We like to start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
Well, I grew up in a military family. My father, at the age of 17, was boots on the ground in Vietnam. And so by the time I came along, he was still at the end stages of his military career. So things were pretty tight. I did have a mother who gave up a career to stay at home and did jobs here and there. But I think one thing they did teach me was that they were very financially, I think, independent in the sense that they never overspent. They implemented the envelope system. They had one credit card, and their concept to me, I always remember this to this day, is if we can't pay for it in cash, we don't necessarily need it. So I don't know. In that respect, they always had and given us what we needed, rather. We had food on the table. They sent us to private schools. They felt education was really important. But at the end of the day, I think they were very financially, I'd say, conservative. And it served them well.
You know, it's funny how these simple things work out well. Like, it amazes me these days that that's no longer the norm. Where it used to be the norm, I think, to say, hey, live within your means. If you can't afford it, don't buy it. But a lot of that has shifted with the current way people do their spending. And people get in trouble because of that.
I agree. I think accessibility to information, accessibility to just the quick touch of a button, to have Amazon at our door, to have food at our door. It really doesn't necessarily teach us those lessons because it's just ingrained, I think, in the kids coming up, the generations coming up. So yeah, I agree with you there for sure.
And part of that is also the swipe culture versus the cash culture. When you had to peel off $100 bill or a whole bunch of 20s, you felt it. When you just tap, there's no feeling whatsoever. People don't seem to register with what they're actually doing and how much it's costing them. And I'll be honest, at the end of the month, I don't know how much I've spent until I go sit down in Quicken and download all the transactions, go, wow, spent a lot more than I thought we did, because it just happens.
Agree. I think about, again, growing up, I was always taught to always have cash with me. And even it seems interesting when you try to pay in cash or pay in any means nowadays. It is just the tap. And I still believe personally that there's something to be said about having cash on hand. I think it teaches us a little bit of self-discipline. Again, if I don't necessarily have it right here, do I necessarily need it?
Well, and that's the thing with cash is it's physical, and how much is left in your pocket, right? You can see, hey, I've got this many 20s or whatever it is you're carrying, and I've got to get through the next couple of days. And so you make choices, and it's different that way. Out of curiosity, so your parents taught you about money, nothing from school?
Nothing from school, which was something I was going to mention. Maybe in college, I learned a little more by taking courses or being interested in, but nothing growing up. Again, went to private school, went to Catholic school, but there really wasn't much around. Again, I don't know if it was the time of technology or just the curriculum of what have you at the time, but no. We were kind of on our own and left to our own devices with what our parents, at least for me, what was kind of ingrained and instilled in me. So, yeah.
And I think that's normal. Most people who've come on the podcast have not said, it's a rarity when someone says, I learned it in school. And at most, it was one class at some point over essentially 16 years of education if they went to college.
Yeah, what I found.
So not a lot.
True. And what I found, even thinking back now that you mentioned it, the people or the kids that I was going to school with, I may have saw one or two. There was one particular baseball player who was always reading the New York Times and reading stocks on the newspaper and pulling things out. And when I come to think about it, I think about how he grew up, and his parents were business owners. They were very entrepreneurial. They had large assets. So again, maybe it's something based on profession. Again, military growing up. My father was very disciplined, but access to a lot of income was really not there. And maybe the education that he had growing up just wasn't there. So again, very disciplined, very pragmatic in the way he thinks. My mother as well, they tended to have that very similar mindset, but they didn't grow up with generational wealth. So a lot of, I think, what they tried to instill was what they knew, and just good values. And then I think the rest, for me personally, I just kind of had to look around and go, gee, what's he doing? Or, what's that about? Yeah, for sure.
And that's the way it is for most people. So how did you get into soccer?
So I was always someone who loved to run and play. And I think for me growing up, my father was someone who was very much the father who, if I provided, that's my job, again, my role, but he was my very first coach. And I think he gave me that motivation. To really, to feel seen and to feel really, I think, alive. And from there, I just excelled. Louisiana was not a hotbed for soccer at all. And I sort of had to find teams. I think at the age of 14, I was playing on a women's team because I couldn't really afford to play travel ball until a couple years later, where my parents sacrificed. And from New Orleans, they would drive me to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So a very large part of my childhood and high school career was on the road up to training daily. So we're talking 4-hour commutes there and back, and just excelling and going to camps and going up into Olympic development camps, and then finally into the ACC, which was kind of my dream at the time and still is. That sort of is the hotbed and where national championships are.
And how did it work out?
It worked out okay. It worked out okay. My goal for me was I wanted to win a national title. I wanted to play at the highest level. My idols at the time were Mia Hamm and Christine Lilly. They were on the 99 team. They were a couple years ahead of me, but we all played in the same system. We played against each other in the summer, and things were going well. I did secure a partial starting role my freshman year, which, looking back, the girl from Louisiana was not too shabby, because most of our team at NC State was comprised of either Canadian national team players, U.S. national team players, or Norwegian national team players. But I did have a setback with a back injury my freshman year, and that did have me take off the rest of the season and return to New Orleans for that semester to rehab. And then things kind of shifted from there. So yeah, ups and downs.
So when you say they shifted, what happened next?
Well, I went home to New Orleans to rehab my back. And during that time, I was sent home with a strength program and the trust of my coach that being back in Louisiana would probably be the best fit for me, given just some of the medical team that was down there, and that can really probably help me get back as quickly as possible. And I encountered a difficult time in my life where, during a training session, my very first time back on the track, I believe I was out, maybe 2 months. And my first day back on the track, and I'll put a little trigger warning in here for those who might be listening, I was abducted and attacked by a serial rapist who was out on good behavior. So that really, really shifted me physically, I think, emotionally at the time, and really had to not only get myself better, but kind of face other types of recovery, if that makes sense. So
It does. It's not easy at all to overcome from something like that.
absolutely. No, absolutely. But I can say that I had wonderful support. I had a wonderful family. I don't think it's anything that we ever wish on for anyone. At the same time, it's important to know they did end up catching the individual, and they knew immediately who it was. And the rest was just preparing for a very, very difficult trial that would come up in the ensuing months. So, yeah.
Definitely not easy. So were you ever able to get back to soccer?
I was, at that time, I think when you're 18 years old, for me, the understanding of therapy and what have you, for me, I just wanted to play. And I think I used that as a positive outlet. I had the support of my family. And I think I really used that to fuel my training and my recovery once the physical injuries were healed up. And I actually ended up returning to NC State, probably the most fit and lightest I've been, and was top of the charts with all of the recordings, and everything's measured in preseason. If you play in Carolina, um, everything is a competitive cauldron. And I actually ended up earning a starting position my sophomore year. So I really did use sport, and I think the physical movement to help me through that time. And I think over time, you tend to work on the other areas. But yeah.
So what happened once you graduated from college?
So when I graduated from college, I had a couple things on my plate. I still wanted to play, but at the time, and my age is showing, we didn't have the women's professional league quite yet. We had at the time the W League, or the women's semi-pro leagues, if you will, that had teams. So I ended up going back to New Orleans, and I started a job in Dallas. So I'm going to backtrack there. I worked in Dallas for a year, and I played for a semi-pro team called the Dallas Lightning. And there was inklings that the women's professional league was going to start. So things kind of folded in Dallas. I did a stint up in Chicago as well. And I decided to, at the time, go back to graduate school and at least further my education, with the intent in mind that I would continue to train and get myself ready for the combines. So the combines were coming up, and I felt like I had just as much an opportunity than anyone else at the time. And then another little shift happened for me, I'll say, and things again kind of took a different direction, and I found myself regrouping once again. And I didn't know if
Never a straight line, huh?
Never a straight line. I didn't know if you had a follow-up question to that. I could see your face. At least I could laugh now.
No, I mean, it's always a constant struggle.
Yeah. To further that, I guess maybe to build on that story, I started graduate school, and about 2 weeks in, I went on a training ride. Just part of my training I do. I'd usually warm up with a 10, 20 mile cycle, depending on the day. And about 10:30 in the morning, I was hit by a person on a cell phone. Their car met my bike, and I sustained significant injuries, skull fractures, TMJs, multiple lacerations, ACL, MCL tears. Briefly left the body. That's probably for another podcast. But nonetheless, it really, really, and I think the ability for me to come back quick enough. I did have some discussions with the team here, actually the Bay Area Cyber Rays. I now live in California, and there was some talk about maybe allowing or having me get drafted on contingency, but I never was able to take the field at that caliber again and actually, try out for the combine. So essentially my professional career ended there. So again, another battle of resilience coming back, but everything happens for a reason. I can't help but to believe that. And I really just kind of focused in on school and my education at then.
So what happened next?
So what happened next is I finished up school and down in the University of New Orleans. I studied to be a clinical exercise physiologist, probably fitting. My specialty and niche was the heart. And I always just had this fascination with the human body. I think someone who's trained and understood what the body can do and what it can endure just was a natural fit. And I was moving along, actually was going to consider medical school. So I started the wheels in motion for medical school and was feeling really good about it. And then a little storm called Hurricane Katrina came in. So that was around 2005. And the whole city was disrupted. Many of us, and again, my heart goes out to those right now in North Carolina who are managing the catastrophic floods and loss. I can certainly resonate with that. It's hard to put words to, but nonetheless, everything kind of stopped for all of us. My hospital at the time I was working with and working for rather went under. It was the hospital that was featured on 5 Days at Memorial on Apple TV. Very interesting story. And I lost my home. So basically, we became on the road evacuees for about 3 months. And I ended up in Houston, Texas. I was transferred by my hospital system and ended up taking a position similar to what I was doing in Houston, Texas. Never a dull moment, Rocky.
And well,
Never a dull
and I
moment.
think that's what people look at the success people have, and they don't realize all the bumps along the way, right? There's all the things that people go through to get to where they are, and so that's kind of what happens. But it's also that path that shapes us and shapes our future and where we somewhat end up in how we do that. And I'm assuming a lot of that is what led you to the work that you do today.
Yeah, I think so. I think after the accident in 99, I really appreciated what the mind and body can do when it is focused and when it's in an environment to heal. And I think I've always had a fascination, even as a young child, with physiology, science. And I think what I did is I used my experiences because, again, I think that shapes us. And I just wanted to do good with it. And again, working with the heart, working with patients who have been through very near death experiences like I have a couple times in my life. Not similar, but I understand that. And I think I could resonate with my patients when I say, listen, I don't know what it's like to have my chest cracked open, but I know what it's like to not do the things that I want to do. I know what it's like to be laid up in a hospital. I know what it's like to be laid up for months and emotionally, physically be broken. But I'm here to help and I can resonate with you. So I think it has been a very interesting fit. Also, the things that we turn to sometimes when life gets difficult. So, yeah, absolutely.
So, what is it that you do today? How do you help people?
So I kind of wear a couple hats. I'm still a clinician. So I am out here in Central California as a clinical EP, and I still work in the rehab spaces with the heart. My specialty there is really stress in the heart and how stress impacts us and really is an independent risk factor to heart and sudden death. And throughout that time, over the last 10 or 15 years, I started after Hurricane Katrina, my fitness and wellness company, Retrain, which at the time was really geared towards movement. Again, just getting people moving and active and getting that dopamine going and helping people with those trauma responses that it seemed like everybody in the city of New Orleans was experiencing at the time. And throughout this time, in the last, 15, almost 20 years now, I moved more into the coaching spaces where I've consulted with different hospital systems, different coaching platforms. And I'm currently consulting with the Reframe app, which is one of the number one alcohol reduction apps in the country. And simultaneously, I relaunched Retrain into more of the coaching space, helping healthcare professionals dealing with burnout, stress, those who may turn to alcohol misuse as a result of stress and perhaps pandemic, perhaps burnout, and what have you. And really using my experience of movement as medicine and peppering in the strategies that I have learned along the way personally and also professionally in the clinical spaces.
So, when you say movement as medicine, can you explain that?
Oh, absolutely. I think exercise, as we know, I mean, there's tons of research that it is a natural healer. It is medicine for our body. And we know the rates of obesity. We know with technology, as wonderful as it is, uh, our kids, our youth, and even our adults are doing this more and moving less. Physical activity is not even it's elective in schools. And we're seeing it in the comorbidities. So young people are turning diabetic, probably won't outlive their parents. So exercise is a natural dopamine producer. We know by research the importance of movement being instilled now in some corporations, definitely here on the West Coast with a lot of startups. You're going to see time that they're giving employees, they're supporting exercise, they're paying for programs to keep people well. But yeah, movement, exercise is just a wonderful, wonderful way to heal not only the body, but I think the mind versus maybe just popping a pill and calling it the day. And it isn't always
Have you
necessarily.
found popping the pill work?
I think there's value to, again, I'm a clinician and I understand the value of medicine, right? If someone's having a heart attack, it's going to be important that we get them on board with some Plavix and clopidogrel, right? I understand that. But I think really getting people into the concept that movement doesn't have to be necessarily the Nike commercial. It doesn't have to be, necessarily someone who's doing this super high intensity, but it can be somatic. It can be in different forms, and it can be structured around what works for you. Again, I always say finding your fitness fit versus just telling people, oh, that's the new phase or that's the new, calisthenics is the thing now. It drives me crazy. My dad was doing calisthenics. But we just slap a name on it. We market it out and we make millions of dollars, but not a bad business strategy, but it isn't for everyone. And sometimes when we throw people into these types of programs, it can actually be counterproductive because they're scared, they're frustrated, they get hurt, and then they end up back at square one, back on the couch. So, yeah. So I always say movement because it covers a lot and it's very individualized for the person versus, go do some high intensity. I'm not going to tell a person, who has a ton of contraindications, who might be morbidly obese and have injuries to go do that. That would actually be very disruptive to how they're going to proceed and progress. So, yeah. So it's very strategic. It has to be.
It does. I mean, you can't go from not doing anything to going full swing. And it's funny because we were talking before we hit record about people and building wealth, and it's the same concept.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who do 75 hard or used to be P90X or
Yeah.
they all getting in all these crazy things instead of just showing up and doing consistent good. And I think there's even studies that show if you consistently perform at 80%, you will win long term versus the people who were overexerting themselves and doing the 110%. Type of activities because they end up being hurt. They can't go the distance. And I don't think people realize that. It's age-old wisdom, but yet it doesn't seem to come across. I don't know what you've seen.
I think it's twofold there. We see the power of what social media does, and we know that there's a high association to people's happiness and how much social media they use. The more they're on there, the more comparative. That's just our human nature. There's a study at Yale by one of the professors, and her name eludes me, but she does positive psychology and the science of happiness. And there is a direct correlation to what we see in social media and us becoming less happier. So if we're watching all these people doing 75 hard and at the time, now it's calisthenics and what have you, it's motivating, but then we become very competitive. And then we kind of lose, why are we doing this? Right. And then we end up getting hurt. I think that's where strategy comes in and really, really understanding what works for you. And that takes discipline, that takes time, and it's not going to happen overnight. We didn't get our health to where we are. We didn't develop heart disease. We didn't develop obesity overnight. And the process has to become sustainable, but habit forming, right? Versus I'm going to do what John or Jenny did because they're hitting it, 10, on day 10 of, 75 hard. Again, not knocking it. For some people, that works. But what I do find in my industry is a lot of people fall off because there's so much more to it.
Well, by its very nature, you will fall off because what do you do on day 76, right? You do your
Absolutely.
75 days, and then what? You
Yeah.
haven't built, you can't do 75 hard for your whole life. It's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable.
So
And
what
I
are you
think
going to do?
no, that's great. I see this often in coaching spaces. I see this in alcohol reduction spaces where, people are counting days and they get to day 90, and or we people some of us will do 90-day challenges, or what now? And often we hear from not only fitness but people who are just looking to change habits and changing poor habits. When we get wrapped around numbers, and what I say is, here's the thing. It's really, really important to understand why you're doing this and developing sustainable habits and understanding what that means, not just in your exercise, but how you go about your day, how you go about organizing your work, because it does overflow. It does overflow. And I think that's the difference between some programs and versus just clicking on a button and going, okay, here's my workout program, because what do I do next? And that's where I think the importance of really teaching people sustainable habit change and helping pepper that into other parts of their life to where it becomes not so scary and not so challenging, because you start them at day one, and to where it just becomes a way of life. Just like with Profit First, starting very, very conservative, 1%. I'm still learning, but over time, again, improvement. We often hear if we could just increase or improve just 1%. And that's practice. To me, it's all about practice. We practice at everything every day.
We do. And 1% compounds massively. Um,
Yeah.
Now, nobody can improve 1% a day, but if you could, you'd improve 365% over a year,
Yeah.
which is massive. But even if you do 1% a month, that's still 12% a year, and it's a constant growth. What I've learned to do is to stop focusing on outcomes and start focusing on habits that build the outcomes that I want. And then this way, I just focus on doing the habits, making them part of my everyday and building them into my life. And then just continuing and not worrying so much about the outcome. The outcome will come. And for a lot of things, the outcomes are so far away that it hard it it's not always easy to see the sustainability of it.
Absolutely. I think just staying present and giving people and giving clients strategies to keep them present, giving them action, however you want to call it, action items, goals to stay in the present moment. I agree. I agree, because we have to find joy. I mean, it's not easy. Again, anytime we're embarking on something new, it's scary, it's a little bit intimidating. But I do believe with the right system and with the right maybe coach or person, making sure it's a good fit, we can find joy in those little things, and finding joy just in the daily things that we do, and taking pride in it. I think that's another thing. Not just, again, the age of today is go, 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 get through it, press this button, press that button, get the coffee going. But, I encourage people to actually slow down, even if it's for 15 minutes a day, and be very, very intentional with how they use those 15 minutes, just finding joy in it.
It's funny, I live in a bubble. I live in a bubble, so I don't see what other people are doing. But I think coming out of COVID now, I'm noticing life being busy again. And I'm
Mhm.
just glad I don't participate in that and I don't have to deal with it. And it's all good. But I don't always realize how nutty other people's lives are.
Well,
One of
I
the
see it
things you talk
often.
about is you do.
I do.
I'm sure you do.
Well, because they're at the point where they're sick, they're stressed out, they're overworked. Um, so they need that person. So it can be sometimes a lot of emotional labor. So I understand. That's what I mean by it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Always vulnerability and empathy play into all of this.
I think vulnerability is really so important. And we're learning now in the last 5 to 7 years with authors like Dr. Brene Brown bringing forth that concept of being a superpower. Just being your authentic self and just being able to be honest with yourself. And when you're honest with yourself, it allows you to kind of tell others. Again, I don't know if it's a cultural thing. Growing up in a military family, I grew up with a Latin father where you're tough, you suck it up, you get through it. And I think we're finding with accessibility to information now, the generations come up have accessibility to read about things. And more people are writing about these things, and it's giving them permission. So I think it's incredibly valuable and incredibly powerful when you are trying to incorporate that into making sustainable change. Because the more vulnerable you can be, the more honest at the end of the day you're going to be received, I think, and people will appreciate that. I think people really do appreciate when you can just be like, listen, I got 20% today. That's it. Or, this is where I'm at. I know as a clinician and as a coach, I appreciate that because at least I know what I'm working with. So, it's so incredibly important. And I think we're in a society and generation where we're now allowed and we're giving each other permission. And that's important, it really is important.
Why do you think people struggle to slow down?
I think that's $1 million question. I think part of it again is generational society. I think sometimes what we feed ourselves is what we tend to become. I think a lot is driven by social media, by television, again, going back to the study from Yale and, the science of happiness. As human beings, we're comparative beings. So when we're watching and feeding our minds with things that are maybe not accurate for the average person, it actually makes us become more depressed, less unhappy, and then we sort of want to keep up, if you will, with others, and then we just start doing a vicious circle. I think it's really important too with our school systems and what we're teaching others. There's not much time. It's the United States as a whole is a very competitive nation. We want to keep up. We want to be the best. But I think sometimes we're losing sight of the little things. Again, physical activity, time to just rest and take care of yourself. Rest just doesn't seem to be an option. And one of the things I often will say to clients and patients alike is exercise, nutrition is the peanut butter and jelly, your work, all of this, but the bread that holds it together is your rest and your time to just reset. And I think it's a cultural thing until you realize that you don't have to be a part of that. And that takes a lot.
What else are you noticing shifting culturally?
In respect to?
Just people's behaviors and how they're doing.
I think the pandemic really brought out a lot of a lot. Let's just put it that way. The only thing I can compare it to was when Hurricane Katrina happened. At the height of the pandemic, we saw people rushing around. And to me, that was normal. The people around me at the time, the person I was dating was like, we're in the grocery store and people are rushing. And I'm like, okay, this is like a hurricane, but at a higher level, a much larger level. And I think what it brought out was people's vulnerability. The bubbles that we live in and that we have to stretch ourselves and that things aren't always going to be and that things change. Change is constant. And a lot of people had to change. Everything changed. Families broke up. People were cohabitating. They saw their spouses more than maybe they wanted to see. But it was constant change and really I think we have a society where we're very structured and we say we have control. I often say, do we really have control? Do we really? But it kind of went awry. And so I think now that we're kind of coming out, what I'm seeing, depending on the situation, is people wanting more help, people needing more help, and people, trying to kind of grasp for a way to heal. I don't know if it's probably a combination of just physical. I see the physical often, but with the physical, I see the emotional and the spiritual. It's there. I've seen people who've had to switch careers and think outside the box in ways that they never had to. And it's stretching us and it's forcing us to kind of, I guess you can say, come out of our bubble and maybe in some ways realize that we need more community. We need more think we're a society that of many, we're very isolated. We don't have a lot of extended families like you see in other cultures. People are spread out all over. So I personally am seeing, I think, people trying to build more community. They're just not sure how. That makes sense. I just see this like cry
It
for collective healing.
does. And
Yeah, it's such a loaded question. I think it can go in so many ways, but I'm really speaking maybe from a health and wellness standpoint, but it really impacts everything. Because if you're not healthy, you can't work. We really are nothing without our health. At the same time, yeah, it's interesting.
and you said something interesting. How does the emotional and the spiritual tie back to the physical?
Well, I mean, there's a book where I have here, The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know if you've ever read it. Um, uh, Dr. Vanderkolk, a wonderful book about the connection between how emotion, and in this case, he prefaces with post-traumatic stress with veterans, PTSD, and how our bodies hold on to this, whether it's trauma, whether it's injury, and if it's not treated and if it's not um, paid attention to, and if it's pushed down, it manifests physically. And we have tons of research that show, again, stress alone is an independent risk factor to cardiovascular disease. You can be exercising and eating, but if you're stressed and you're not sleeping, chances are, you're going to have a cardiac event. So there's a high correlation to that. And spiritually, I think, is our emotional health. I'm not always necessarily saying religion, but I do believe there's that triple threat there, that not that triple threat. There's that three part of us. There's the physical, there's the mental, and then there's the spiritual. And maybe it is a triple threat for some because they don't address it. We don't address it. We just work until we can't. So yeah, I see it all the time, and more with research, more and more with alcohol, what it does to the body and the mind. So high correlation. And again, wonderful book, The Body Keeps the Score, is a great, I think, evidence-based book that can really demonstrate these connections.
And I think for the first time, I'm starting to see a lot of people, and I think the trends are that too, stopping alcohol altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know in the past it's always, part of the social structure. But it seems like it is shifting. And yet, even though it is shifting, if you go out and try and find something decent to drink that's not full of sugar and alcohol, it's almost impossible to find things out there in restaurants, so to speak, or at events. At home, it's a lot easier. You have a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rocky. I think the generation coming up, there is less interest in drinking. We're not seeing, again, I do consult with the Reframe app, and that's a wonderful alcohol reduction app that helps people change their relationship. And I do see that shift. And I think it's interesting. I call it tricky because it's a legal drug and it's glamorized and glorified by our celebrities, by our influencers. And yeah, it's part of game day. It's part of events. It's part of sadness. It's part of, happiness. And it's really, really a tricky one. And even working in these spaces and working with people, it can be tricky from my outsider or friends who maybe just don't see it that way. But I do see a huge shift with the generation coming up drinking less. And I think we're getting there with alcohol, non-alcoholic options. I think there are some companies out there that are starting to develop non-alcoholic options for people. And I think also consumers being proactive with their local stores, their local bars, asking restaurants, what are your alcohol-free options? So I'm out here in California, I'm seeing it a little bit more more trending that way, depending where you go. But I agree, the generation coming up is drinking less alcohol, which is good.
And I didn't even know if it was generational, because I'm hearing it even from older generations saying the same thing. They're walking away from it. and for a variety of reasons. Health. I know for the longest time, wine seems to go back and forth on exactly how much is good for you, but now everyone seems to be going to zero.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Two parts in that. The generations, I think, our older generations, there's some are stopping because they have to. They don't have a choice because they've damaged their bodies to
Mm.
the point to where they just don't have a choice. Where I think the generation coming up is seeing more information, again, access to information. And the generations before us, and even my generation, I didn't have that information. It's just like tobacco. We call alcohol kind of the new tobacco. My mother growing up, my parents were both smokers. My mom, I believe, smoked during her pregnancy, but she's like, I didn't have that information. We just didn't know. I mean, gosh, doctors would support. If you look at the old covers they would have Camels cigarettes and they would light up after, and it just wasn't. So I think the same is with alcohol. We're discovering that no alcohol is actually good, and the idea behind that one drink or glass of wine, it wasn't necessarily the alcohol we were thinking about. We were thinking about the flavonoids in the grapes that were a cardioprotective benefit to the heart, but somehow that morphed
Mm.
into a liquor, a shot of liquor to beer, and we know what alcohol is. So it's never the alcohol as much as it was the flavonoids in the grapes that were to help being a healing, cardioprotective benefit for the vessels in the heart. So like everything, it kind of morphs. Yeah.
It does,
So
and it's taken a long, long time for cigarettes. So I'm assuming it's going to take a long, long time for alcohol as well to make that shift.
well, we're getting there. I know Canada, the FDA, the guidelines in Canada are now changing from that 1 to 2 drinks to no drinks. The recommendations. I think we're on track for that. To that 1 to 2 drinks a day are healthy. We know the research shows that really no alcohol is healthy, but we also have people who can mindfully moderate, right? So whether we get there, but we have to. I don't want to discredit people because there are a lot of people who are very mindful with their moderation. But we just know the research, so that's where it becomes tricky. And I think working with the heart
Is
and seeing what I see, and they're getting younger and younger from binge drinking, just a weekend binge drinking, um, heart failure. They'll go into congestive heart failure, or maybe they'll go into atrial fibrillation. So that's scary.
Are you seeing heart patients come in then at younger ages? Is that what's going on?
Absolutely. Definitely since the pandemic, I think we had people who were kind of sitting around, and well, we all were sitting around, and I'm not suggesting people were lazy, but I think there were people that had a transfer addiction, and they turned to alcohol as maybe a coping mechanism. Um, I know I started to do that. I said, "Whoa, this has to change. That this is not okay." But it's an easy transfer. I mean, if I can sit around and get my dopamine while watching TV versus going out and exercising, here I am, the physiologist. But for most people, that's the easy way, right? But we also know as much as you get that quick rush of dopamine, unfortunately it's the other hormones and neurotransmitters in our body that also have the negative effect. So we heighten one, but we're also dipping others, which causes all the other things that happen with alcohol. But yeah, I mean, I see them younger, and I work in Central California, so we're in the salad capital of the United States. So we have a lot of our farm workers who, after working in the fields, they just want to congregate and be amongst each other, and we'll drink. And on weekends, we'll get. And I'm not saying this to only farm workers. I'm just giving an example that we'll have. We just know by the end of the weekend, we're going to have an X amount of people coming in with that cough and that congestion after a binge. Well, they're going into heart failure. So very, very common, very
Hmm.
common. So we'll see that. So for me, it was just a wake up call as well. Um, to see, patients, because I've been working with the heart now and in the rehab spaces for almost 20 years and all over the United States, from Louisiana with the highest rate of obesity to Texas to New York, and now on the West Coast. So very similar. Very similar.
Yeah, it's changing, and people have to figure out what they want to do with their life and how they want to live it. And the information, it's funny, the information's out there, but even with the information, people don't necessarily change until they have a trigger moment or something's happened that that pushes them, or they decide to. But at the same point, there's people who will never change, regardless of their health.
No, it's true. Often, we'll see that. A lot of times I see people changing. The change isn't always necessarily for them, but maybe it's something else or for somebody. Again, we often see, again, with cardiac arrest, and maybe it's their third time. I call my patients sometimes the repeat offenders, or I'll call them a graduate student if they're back for the third time or fourth time. But change is tough. I wish I had the magic. I wish I had the magic. The only thing I could say is with tobacco, all the years we can have access to the patches, we can have access to the best counseling. But what I have found with tobacco, is the patient just has to be ready. They just have to be ready. No medicine, no counseling, the patient. And I think with anything, we personally have to be ready and be sick of it, or whatever it is that brings that meaningful change. And I've seen so many different reasons. I wish, and sometimes there is no rhyme or reason, which is what makes this all so interesting.
You never know.
You never know.
Secret to living an abundant life.
Being very, very gentle with myself, being easy on myself, giving myself permission. To just be okay with making mistakes and failing.
We are our harshest critic. We wouldn't let other people talk to us that way.
Yeah, but it's a hard lesson to learn.
It is. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
I think it goes back to what I just said earlier, that everything works out, but just be patient and easier on yourself. Giving ourselves, we hear this term often, but just giving ourselves a little grace. It's not that serious. It's not that serious. And looking back with how I went through things, and the pressure I put on myself, emotional, physical, emotional labor, I'm glad I could be here now to say that, to be able to give myself a little grace with that. Actually, a lot of grace.
If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
Oh boy, be patient with yourself. Be patient. Everything takes time. And when you're 18, our brains aren't even developed to what we're 30. So be patient, because one day you will look back. And, we hear this growing up, but we're going to look back and go, man, if I could just go back with the mind I have now and the body I had. But patience, just patience. Everything's quick. Everything's a touch of a button. Just taking time to slow down and just spend it with some thought and patience. It goes a long way. It really does.
Yeah. And in today's world, we all want it immediately. It's hard to do that.
Yeah. And then depending on who's, cheering us on and rooting us on and giving us what maybe we don't need, and again, just access. I mean, we have access to so much information. I know even when we're talking about these hurricanes, I can't watch it, but back in 2005, we didn't have social media. We didn't have iPhones. We had flip phones, and text messages were just happening. So, the access to information and things that people have is just, it can be so empowering, but it can also cause so much suffering as well.
So true. If people would like to learn more about you and your services, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can check out my website at www.christacamarillo.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn under Christa Camarillo, or Instagram at Christa Camarillo Official.
And we'll put that all in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Rocky. It was such a pleasure. And I'm looking forward to Profit First. I am. I'm excited.
It's a great system.
I know. Again, just listening and the simplicity of it, but just taking the time to sit down and map it out, I think is just getting started. So looking forward to it.
That's always the thing. The first step is always the hardest.
For sure. For sure.
But eventually you get there.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for checking out this unedited video of the Richer Soul podcast. You can find the full episode along with all the back episodes at richersoul.com. This podcast is brought to you by Profit Comes First, where we help business owners to have a more profitable and growing business so they can live the life of their dreams. Check that out as well wherever you listen to all this content.